welcome directory. So let's pray. Loving God, we think today of those about to leave prison, the people for whom our time together today will bring them support, non-judgment and love, in just the way Jesus did for those who had done wrong in his time. For people facing a new and different life on the other side of the prison gate, we ask for a steadfast heart which no unworthy thought could drag downwards, an unconquered heart which no hardship can wear out, an upright heart which no worthless purpose can ensnare. Give them also the understanding that will lead them to know you, the diligence to seek you, and a faithfulness that will lead them not only to embrace their God, but to hold on. Give us an understanding of those who look for a Christian homecoming, a desire to provide a loving and forgiving community. And help us to trust in you, Lord, that you will heal the hearts and minds of those we welcome in your name. Amen. So I'll hand over now to Emily. Emily, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Siggy. I think we're just going to screen share at the moment, and Catherine, I'll be grateful if you're able to put up our PowerPoint. Thank you. So yeah, Siggy, thank you so much, and it is such a privilege and pleasure for us as the Welcome Directory to be joining you this afternoon and sharing a little bit about our work. As Siggy mentioned, for the Welcome Directory team, we're joined by James, who is our Capacity Development Officer. We're joined by Amelie, who heads up our comms and fundraising, and Bob is one of our trustees, as well as being a faith and belief advisor. We're also joined this afternoon by some very special guests, and as we go through this session, we will introduce them to you, and you can hear about some of their experiences and their expertise as well. So on our next slide, I just wanted to talk you through the vision of the Welcome Directory, just to give you a bit of background if you're not too familiar with our vision. So we work really closely with faith communities because we're striving for faith communities to be places that are welcoming, accepting, as well as safe. And we'll talk a little bit more later on about safeguarding as well. But for us, people are very much, as it's said on the screen here, people are very much at the heart of what our work is about. It's about people expressing themselves, continuing their faith, but really feeling that they are welcome, accepted, and that they belong as part of a faith community. Whilst we recognise that on this call we're Christians, we do work across faiths and beliefs as well. So we represent very much the diversity of faith and beliefs as represented by the prison system as well. But at the moment we've got 6 world faiths represented amongst our directory, which is really exciting. So on our next slide, I just wanted to talk you through, why do we exist? What is the issue that we're trying to address as an organisation? So we recognise that many individuals find faith in prison, but many individuals also rekindle their faith in prison. And so actually for the percentage of people who have faith within a prison setting, of which is about 15%, when it comes to the point of release, actually only about 20% of those individuals who have faith then go on to join a faith community beyond the prison gates. And for us, that is a massive loss. It's a loss for the individual who doesn't continue their faith journey or just chooses not to connect. And it's a real loss as well for faith communities, for churches, to not have those individuals join them and be worshipping and doing life alongside each other. And that's what we're trying to address. We recognise that for many individuals who have spent time in prison, there's a real fear about not being accepted, about rejection, because they have a criminal record. And that's what, as an organisation, we are working alongside faith communities, alongside churches, trying to raise awareness of these issues, to realise that actually, what does our faith say? What does the Bible say about these issues? And how can we address this together? How can we take action? So on our next slide, I just wanted to talk through what it is that what we're offering essentially in terms of the directory. So we have an online searchable map, which is available beyond the prison gates, obviously. But in terms of the directory, we have a physical directory similar to the one that you'll see on the screen. And this directory is in every single prison across England and Wales, so 121 prisons or so. And the way it works in practice is that an individual who has faith would liaise with their chaplain and or probation to help them identify a welcoming faith community beyond the gates for when they're released. So essentially we are populating our directory. We currently have 250 faith communities and growing, constantly growing, which is really, really exciting. But essentially how it works in practice is that we don't expect chaplains to have local knowledge of England and Wales in its entirety. It's not possible. So the strength of the directory is actually having that information all in one place of faith communities who are going to guarantee, who have said they will give a really good welcome. They're accepting and they're ready for this kind of work. And that's essentially the strength of it. We don't rely on local knowledge from prison chaplains. And so the directory can be used in that way. Just to be clear as well, we don't make referrals, but we put the information within the directory to empower prison leavers to make the decisions themselves for where they want to continue worshipping. And so essentially it's trying to facilitate those connections through the information within the directory. So I'm hoping that's summarized for you a little bit about the Welcome Directory in a nutshell. It's at this point I'm actually going to hand over to one of our special guests, the Venerable James Ridge. And James is, well, I'll let him introduce himself and what he's going to share about, but as you may or may not know, he is the Chaplain General and Head of Faith Services for Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service. So we'll go to the next slide if that's all right, and I am going to hand over to the Venerable James Ridge. Thank you, James.
Hello. Hopefully you can hear me. We disappeared for a moment, but hopefully you can now hear me. As Emily's just said, I'm James Ridge. I'm Chaplain General, Head of Faith Services for HMPPS. And I join you today from HMP Free Churches Group, where my cellmate and I are just emerging from a period of bang up, able to be able to talk to you today. It's really good to have this opportunity to speak to you. Although I speak to you as an Anglican, I do have some Methodist credentials in that I'm married to a Methodist minister, and so fairly regularly worship within the Methodist tradition, have a great deal of fondness for that church. I've been involved in prisons since the mid to late 90s. I started as a volunteer in HMP Exeter in 1996, before working in various roles, ending up as managing chaplain of Chelmsford Prison, and then after that managing chaplain of Wayland Prison in Norfolk, and from that role to this job which I currently do, where I look after a team of headquarters advisors based at the MOJ in London, but actually situated all around the country, each one looking after a group or a function within the prison service. So our role really is to care for our prison chaplaincy teams, to support them, and to ensure that they're providing what they need to be providing for the men, women and children in our care. Just a few stats in order to begin. As HMPPS, we currently look after, these are figures for the end of April, 79,729 prisoners, and those are mainly males over the age of 18, but that figure does include 3,199 women and 387 children. As Emily said earlier, we currently look after 121 prisons across England and Wales, and situated in those prisons are around 1,300 chaplains. One final figure is just amongst all those prisoners that I just spoke about, roughly 70% register when coming into prison to say that they actually are part of a particular faith or belief tradition. So 70% register to say that they have a faith. The faith needs of all prisoners are cared for by the chaplaincy team within a prison. That team is led by a managing chaplain who generally sits on the senior management team within the prison and reports to the governor, and a team of chaplains who work with that managing chaplain, chaplains who are employed, who work sessionally, or who are volunteers. And in most places, the chaplaincy team is supported by a group of chaplaincy volunteers who are not themselves chaplains, but come in and give their time really generously to help with particularly specific activities, things like running particular groups or visiting particular groups of prisoners, for example, working with those who have been bereaved or those who are particularly at risk of self-harm. Historically, prison chaplaincy began with Elizabeth Fry in the late 18th, early 19th century. She was, of course, a Quaker. She visited prisoners in Newgate Prison in London and campaigned for better conditions for them. In the years that followed, prison chaplaincy became a largely Anglican affair. It was established in statute by the 1952 Prisons Act, which stated that every prison must have a governor, a doctor, and a chaplain in order to function. And that chaplain, of course, was assumed at the time to be Anglican, although other chaplains of other Christian denominations were there in an assistant role. And Methodism particularly has a history actually of providing chaplains to fulfill that assistant chaplain role. Throughout the 1990s, provision was gradually made for other faiths until the mid to late 2000s, under the guidance of one of my illustrious predecessors, the Venerable William Noblet. Chaplaincy became an entirely multi-faith service. We now have chaplains from a large variety of different faith and belief traditions, including those of a humanist or non-religious tradition. And they care for a large number of different faith and belief traditions within the prison service that we recognise officially, and also take care of people of all faiths and none. In the past, the chaplain's role was to provide a daily service, which was attended by all prisoners, and to spend time with prisoners in the days and hours before their execution. Whilst thankfully that role has been consigned to history, the provision of corporate worship is still a key part of a chaplain's duties. Prisoners are entitled to an hour of corporate worship and an hour of education or study within the faith tradition for which they are registered every week. Although COVID has disrupted this in the past couple of years, many prisons are just beginning to get back towards that level of provision. Chaplains also visit every prisoner who is new to the prison within the first 24 hours of their arrival, every prisoner in the prisoner's segregation unit, and residential healthcare unit, if there is one, every day, and all prisoners in the run-up to their release. Chaplains also handle all things to do with bereavement, both breaking the news of the death or serious illness of a loved one, arranging escorts for funeral attendants or visits to the bedside to say goodbye, liaising with a family, hospital, coroner, funeral director, and caring for the prisoner throughout that process. Crucially, chaplains also spend time with staff, supporting them in their day-to-day life and at stressful times for them personally, or when things in the prison are tough. Because of the wide range of different prisons, high security, local, training prisons, open, female, young offenders, holding prisoners of different risk levels and at different stages in their journey through the system, the role of a chaplain can vary quite significantly depending on where they work. But it is the incidental conversations on a wing, landing, or exercise yard, which are common to all chaplains working across the service, which can be the most rewarding for both parties and indeed can make the most difference in someone's life. So far, I've spoken quite a bit about religion and procedure, but not so much about faith. People in prison love to talk. Visitors to prison and new recruits to chaplaincy are often surprised by the openness they experience in their first conversations with prisoners. These are people whose deepest secrets have been discussed at length in an open courtroom and often splashed across the pages of newspapers. They have very little left to hide. There can be no pretense that everything is going swimmingly in their lives. Many of them have a very deep faith, which often bears very little relation to the religion for which they're registered. And they're not ashamed or embarrassed to talk about it, a refreshing change for those of us who have also worked in church contexts in the community. Chaplains are probably the only people who can talk to literally everyone in the prison, and it is accepted without question by anyone. Chaplains are accepted by staff and prisoners alike as part of the furniture. I don't think I can recall a time when, having said to a member of staff that I was going to speak to a particular prison, I've been met with, "What do you want to speak to him for?" Nor a prisoner viewing me with suspicion because I'd spent time with staff. In my early days as a chaplain, I was often amazed by how often a routine walk from one part of the prison to another was punctuated by requests for prayer. And not just, "Would you remember me in your prayers," but "Would you pray for me here, now?" I've prayed with prisoners in cells, on landings and in corridors, in kitchens and recreation rooms, on exercise yards, in offices and in doorways, even occasionally in the chapel. Faith is part of everyday life in prison. Studies have shown that a genuinely held, practiced faith can make a real difference when it comes to the chances of making a success of things on release, and crucially, staying out of prison. But that's where it gets difficult. In prison, people have lots of resources available to them to practice their faith. There are chaplains who can provide support and appropriate material, and they'll find plenty of like-minded people who share their situation. Nobody will stare at them or make them feel uncomfortable when they come to a service. On the outside, it's often a different story. The difficulty of finding that same level of support, of encountering a supportive congregation who won't stare because they're dressed slightly differently once they've worked out what time the service is and which door is the way in. Having someone who will sit beside them and show them when to sit down and when to stand up, which book they should have open, at which page, and so on. Which is why HMPPS are enthusiastic supporters of the Welcome Directory, both as a resource for prisoners, but also for chaplains who are supporting prisoners in those last few days before release. We often get questions about where to go to worship when prisoners are released, and all too often we find ourselves scanning websites trying to work out whether they might be a supportive congregation. To have a go-to guide with places of worship all around the country who have already agreed that they would be welcoming, and a contact which could easily be made is something that I really wish had been available when I was working more regularly in prisons. I think that one of the challenges that the Welcome Directory has met is that people assume that congregations are already doing this and that everyone would be welcoming to an ex-prisoner in their pews. How I wish that were the case, but sadly it really isn't. "I'd love to be involved, but it's a safeguarding nightmare," said one clergy person to me when I suggested they sign up. "We're a very elderly congregation, I'm just not sure they'd accept it," said another. "I don't think people being released from prison come to this area," was another astounding response. The Welcome Directory is really needed by both prisoners and staff in prison to ensure that we can support those who, as representatives of God's church, he places in our care. Thank you very much for listening. It's been really good to be able to speak to you this afternoon.
We're going to move on to the next slide, and we're going to hand over to my colleague James Seeger to do this next section. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. I know we've got the beautiful PowerPoint, but is there any chance that we could have Trishan and myself spotlighted instead of the PowerPoint? Whoever's organised. Ah, thank you. And Trishan, Trishan's going to appear on the screen in a second as well. Ah, there we are. Hello, Trishan.
Hiya.
So this is my friend Trishan, everybody. Just so you know who I am, I'm James. I'm the Capacity Development Officer for the Wellcome Directory. And I'm just going to ask Trishan a few questions. So Trishan, first of all, I'm not going to introduce you. Just tell us why you're here, a little bit about your background and your experience. You know what I mean by that?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm Trishan, and I've actually had experience in prison. I was there for a couple of years. And yeah, I'm just here to talk about my experience and like stuff that challenges that I've faced inside and outside as well.
So thinking about prison for just a few moments, just to bring context to this, Trishan, just tell us what was prison like for you? How did you experience it?
Funny enough, like every time someone asks me this question, the first thing I think about is my answer. And the reason why I think about my answer, because usually I say it was brilliant. Like for me, prison was brilliant. And one of the reasons why I say that is because of I explain it like there was a level of peace that you get in prison that sounds weird, but at the same time, it's not weird, because at that time when I was in prison, I was a Christian. I was born again, and I felt like it was a time where God really had his hand in my life and really looked after me, and things just seemed to run smoothly. And that's not obviously the typical prison story that people expect to hear. But for me, that's what my experience was in prison.
Yeah, I say it sounds strange, although I have met other guys who say, yeah, prison was really good. I think it just highlights the point. Every person has a different experience of life. Every person has a different experience of prison. And so that's really important with faith communities, in the sense of we can't just assume that somebody has a certain experience of life just because they've been in prison. So thank you for that, Trishan. So then thinking about what we're really here to talk about, when you left prison, just talk us through what was the process just before, actually the feelings around release, what happened immediately afterwards, challenges?
I think for me, when I was leaving prison, I think one of the things that I was quite concerned about, which I'm sure many prisoners are concerned about, is the same, as just about getting work and having a job or having a stable income, or sometimes it's where you're going to live. Are you still going to be in the same place when you come out? Are things still going to be the same? And I think that was the thoughts before prison. So I remember, like, even one time I was speaking to one of my friends, and I was just saying, like, really and truly, all I want is to get a job, just to have a job, like just to have a job in an office and just sit down and work. And that's all I wanted to do. So when I came out, I remember applying for jobs, and I came out on a Friday. I had an interview. So I came out Friday morning, had an interview Friday afternoon, didn't get that job, then had another interview on Tuesday, got that job, but then I was still applying for jobs. So then when I got another job, I think on the Wednesday, and then when I got that job, they were like, oh yeah, we just need to, we really want to take you on, it will be nice. But then something was telling me, like, let me just be honest with them, because they didn't ask me about my experience, whether I've been in prison before. I told them that I was in prison. And when I told them I was in prison, the first thing the lady said is, oh no, we can't. That means we won't be able to give you the job anymore. And I think for me, it was a bit deflating, because it was like, even though I've been in prison, I mean, based on my background and based on my experience and based on my character, they liked me. But as soon as they heard that I was someone that's been in prison, then all of a sudden it's like they don't want me anymore. So I think that's one of the challenges that I faced, and even now I still face up to this day, because even when I'm applying for new jobs, it's like the same thing over and over again. And I mean, I've been out of prison since it's like 3.5 years now, and I'm still facing those challenges. So yeah, I say that's one of the hardest challenges that I've faced.
Well, I mean, that must be so disappointing. Deflation was, I think, the word used. It's discriminatory, really, the word in my head. It may sound harsh, but you've been in prison, so you can't have the job, even though you meet all the criteria. Yeah. And have that hanging over you, while Wow. Okay, I mean, were there any other challenges that you particularly faced?
In terms of other I'm trying to think about challenges, but I think in terms of like family and stuff, like my family was there. A challenge that maybe I had that was quite different as well was when I was in prison, my mum died. So when I came out, it was different, like not having mum, because before I went to prison, my mum was there, and then all of a sudden she's not there anymore. So that was a bit hard. And then just I mean, like, I think one of the funniest things that I can think about is that when you were in prison, you didn't have to pay for toilet roll, but when you came out, you had to pay for toilet roll. So things were a bit more expensive. And yeah, that was one of the things that I could add to like the expenses. But yeah, so those sort of things where I was just getting back into normal life again. It's just like the difference between prison. And that's like another thing I said about my experience in prison. You may think that it's hard, but at the same time, coming outside where everything's moving faster, it's a lot harder than you'd think.
Yeah, I think you highlight a couple of really important things there. So, I mean, you highlight the relational aspects. When you come out of prison, relationships are different to when you went in, relationships with family, friends, even church, but also the practical aspects. I've got to buy toilet roll now. Somebody's done that for me for the last 2 years, all that sort of stuff. It's a huge transition, isn't it? And readjustment to society on the outside. Okay, so just moving on, thinking, you know, not just the practical stuff, the relational stuff, the work stuff, all that's really important. But the faith stuff, in our context, the church stuff. I know you were involved with the church before you went in prison, involved with the church afterwards. Just talk about how supportive you found that and what the church was able to do to walk with you at that time.
I think the great thing about my church, even if I go during the time of prisons, that one of the things they used to do is constantly keep in touch with me. They visited me like constantly. It wasn't like a one-off thing. They were just always there, so supportive. So when I came out of prison, I remember going to church. So I came out on a Friday, like I said, and I went to church on the Sunday. And then I think by the following Sunday, they were, because I already was helping out prior to prison, I was serving as one of the ushers. They said that like if I want to get back involved within the ushers, they will allow me to. And I think that one of the reasons why it helped me is because I didn't feel excluded. I felt like I was still involved. I felt like they didn't look at me and think, oh, because you're now a prisoner, similar to what I was explaining about work and stuff like that. They didn't look at me thinking that, oh, your new category as a sentenced person now changes how we look at you. Rather, they made me feel involved. Like, I felt like I was part of a team. I was a part of the church, and everyone was so happy to see me. Like, and it felt genuine. It wasn't like, oh, they're just doing it. It genuinely felt like, oh yeah, Trishan's back. Happy to see you. You're involved. Get yourself included. And yeah, I think that was great. So it didn't make me feel like I was, I don't know, one of these guys that have this bad record, so don't go near him. But rather, it was like, go near him. Like, he's cool. He's a good guy. So yeah.
I love that, the way you're saying, not just attending the church, but getting involved. And getting involved quite quickly, so you're actually able to give out. I'll just throw a comment in here because I know we're going to be talking about safeguarding a little later, but just for clarity for this context, I will say Trishan's offence wasn't what we call high risk. Don't need to say any more than that about it. Yeah. But that's why, you know, getting back on the ushering team, that was cool. So, I mean, just digging a little bit deeper, how do you think that sense of welcoming in and being included helped with your general rehabilitation, or reintegration is probably a better word, back into society? Any thoughts around that?
I think that like I can link it with the work stuff. It's just that for me, it helped me because like I felt like I had somewhere to go to, somewhere where I felt love, somewhere where I would always like feel like I could speak to somebody. Like if I was down, definitely there'll be someone to speak to. If I was going through any issues, there'll be someone to help me. Like getting back into society, I think that church element plays a big part in, for example, myself. And even when I think about other people that have come out from prison that used to go to the chapel with me and stuff like that, and then when they've come out, they've kind of got back into the cycle again, maybe because there wasn't anyone maybe to encourage them and support them, that maybe they can turn their lives around by doing something else or by being involved with something else. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it does. I think that sense of community gives you something. You're saying to focus on, so you get in with the right crowd. By the way, I'm also a prison chaplain, so I get, we that what we call the revolving door. Just because guys don't get in with the right crowd when they leave, joining faith communities really helpful in that. Listen, time's racing on, but what I'm really interested in, so you've got experience of prison, you've got experience of church, being involved. If you could suggest a number of simple or important things that churches could do to help people who've been something similar to what you've been through, what would you suggest they think about?
I would say that the first thing, it will sound like, oh yeah, obviously, but I would say be like Jesus. And the reason why I say be like Jesus is because I always remember the story of Jesus and the adulterous woman, and many people were ready to cast some stones at her, and so many of them were ready, they were all ready, just wanted Jesus to give the go ahead. And then the one question that Jesus asks is that if you've never ever done anything wrong or never ever committed a sin, then cast the first stone. And literally every single person started to walk away. And all Jesus said to her was that, your sins have been forgiven, go and sin no more. And I think that's what churches should do. Churches should be like Jesus, where they accept the person. I mean, it's tough because of some crimes. It's very tough to I was talking about with a friend the other day, with certain crimes, how do we overlook it, or what do we do? What do we actually do? And it's tough because we're merely humans, but I believe that as a church as a whole, there could be someone there that could potentially accept that person, speak to that person. Don't make them feel like they've committed the worst act ever, but rather make them feel like, you know what, Jesus still loves you and Jesus doesn't look at you like that. And you were the point of contact for Jesus. So that's the one thing I can suggest, is just to be like Jesus, and then just make them feel accepted and make them feel loved.
Wow. I'm just thinking, what you said there, be like Jesus, accept them. Really simple. I think the practice around that is probably, tough. And on that, do you think there's any barriers? So speaking honestly, you know church, you.
Yeah.
What do you think churches would struggle with?
As in terms of an ex-offender?
Yeah.
I genuinely believe churches will struggle with someone that's maybe committed a sexual assault act, maybe a rapist, maybe potentially even a murderer. One of the things that I used to have heated debates about in prison with the other prisoners was about maybe a rapist, maybe someone that's committed a sexual assault or something like that. And what they used to do, they used to say that, don't talk to that person or don't stand near that person because they've done this. But then when I looked around, all of us were within that prison. So all of us had done wrong. So it's how do I single out this crime over that crime? And I understand one might seem worse than the other. Even sometimes they look at a rapist and say that, oh, he's worse than a murderer. But then the murderer's taken someone's life. But for some reason, they feel like that's a great, I don't know, they feel like it's better than a rapist. But I was just but we can't really single them out. And sometimes the issues that some people may have, we don't know where it's come from. It could be from their young, could be from their youth, could be from their family history, could be from whatever. But to single someone out like that, I know it's hard, but at the same time, I always try and I even ask myself, how would I respond to that person? What do I do, or what can I do to make them feel like Jesus is also there for them? Because otherwise we then put a limit on Jesus and what Jesus, or who Jesus loves. But the Bible tells us that God loves everyone, and that's why he gave us Jesus. So that's one of the things that I think churches will struggle with, if I'm honest.
Time's gone, but I'm just going to echo what you said a minute ago. Don't put limits on Jesus.
Yeah.
Speaking as a Christian chaplain myself, I think that's a powerful statement. I'll just let that around our heads. I'll leave you with that. But thank you, Trishan, so much for sharing so openly. Really, really helpful. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, would just like to echo James's thanks to you, Trishan. Thank you so much for sharing that. So interesting and so important for us to hear first-hand accounts, I think. So thank you so much from each of us. This brings us on to the next section of our webinar. So this will be discussional. I think Katrin is going to put us into smaller breakout groups. And we're going to be discussing around 5 questions. So hopefully you can see them on your screens. So these questions will focus around the barriers that people might face upon release from prison, how faith communities can help, whether there's a gap between what your faith community teaches and what it does, and what faith communities might do differently. I should probably mention that we have about 15 minutes, I think, for this activity, so not too long, but hopefully that gives the sense of enough time for you to sort of exchange ideas and share experiences. I hope that sparked off some interesting conversations for you, and you were able to share experiences. So thank you so much for engaging. I think without further ado, I am going to hand over to Bob, who is going to talk a little bit about safeguarding.
Excellent. Thank you ever so much, Emily. James has just had to duck out, so he's managed to get out of the cell and he's gone into another meeting briefly. So he's going to come back and join us in about a quarter of an hour. Throughout the session, we've spoken about faith communities being welcoming and accepting. But what Katie and I would like to talk about over the next, say, 15 minutes or so is about them being safe as well. I think it's really important that we recognise that safety it's essential for the faith community, but it's also essential for the person that's leaving prison. It's essential that we talk about safeguarding. It's also one of the first questions that people ask us when they talk about the Welcome Directory and about the possibility of their church joining the Welcome Directory. They ask us, what about safeguarding? And so actually it is a key requirement that any faith community that's joining the Welcome Directory has got an active safeguarding policy. And we underline that point, active, and they've got a named safeguarding lead. I want to look briefly at what safeguarding might look like, what it might look like, what safety might look like, what it might look like for the faith community, for the church as a whole, what about children, what about young people, what about vulnerable adults, and what about the prison leaver? What does safety look like for the person that's coming out of prison? We talked in our breakout group briefly about, does the whole church need to know about everyone's offences? And that may make them feel very unsafe. When we did the initial research into what was needed by people coming out of prison to help them to settle into faith communities, why didn't they do it? We asked that question repeatedly. I think we asked about 120 different people, what is the problem? The overriding theme was judgment, was the idea that people felt as if they might be judged again, that they felt unsafe coming into churches. When someone looks around a chapel and they see everyone else in the chapel, they know where they sit in that pecking order. Trishan talked a little bit about the differences that somebody might see, somebody who had committed sexual offence to somebody that had committed murder to somebody that had perhaps been in for fraud. There is that pecking order. When you go into church, you know where in the pecking order you're going to sit if you've just come out of prison. And it's similar to the situation that you might that Trishan described when you went in for a job, that you look okay initially, but then, oh, you've just come out of prison. And people will have that self-talk as soon as they come in. So what does safety look like for the church, the faith community, for our young people, and what does it look like for the prison leaver? First of all, people leaving prison are usually nervous about finding a new faith community or a new church. Trishan was lucky, and I got to meet his pastor when he was in jail. And he had a wonderful church that looked after him throughout his time. They came and visited him. They came on what we call ecclesiastical visits, so they visited him in the chapel. But for some who may have found faith in prison for the first time, or may have been moving area, or may just be rekindling faith, then going to church, as for all of us, can be quite a daunting experience. Headlines in the paper don't help either, do they? The concept that people in prison are monsters, that's where we put the monsters, and that people coming out of prison are similarly monsters. You know, how often every year do we see such and such was released on parole and has reoffended in some way or another, and that message just gets reiterated all the time. What doesn't get reiterated all the time are the thousands and thousands of people, something like 53,000 every year, that do come out of prison, and almost 50% of those never commit another offence. Nobody ever mentions the 25,000 people or so that come out and then don't reoffend. The Welcome Directory, we don't encourage anyone to take previous convictions lightly. We're aware that there are risks attached to being an open and inclusive community, but there are also huge rewards attached to that. Welcome doesn't mean that anything goes. There is structure and there are appropriate boundaries. We want to explore in the next little bit, is there a place for trust within this? There's a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion around risk based on people's previous behaviour, and probation service talk about static risks and dynamic risks. But actually, there's been quite a lot of research that talks about trust, and trust as being something that helps to be a positive factor in helping to mitigate risk. But what trust are we talking about? Well, I'd like to suggest that we're talking about well-placed, diligent, informed, good trust. Trust that actually helps to build relationships, trust that helps to get to know people for who they are and for who they're not. It's a trust where churches and faith communities might be aware or will be aware of what the actual risks are and not just perceived risks. So someone who may have perhaps come out of prison for charity fraud, a risk assessment that says this person should never be put in a position where they're not in contact with any children, because there might be a risk assessment policy that says that people coming out of prison shouldn't have those contacts. Well, that's actually misplaced mistrust. Well-placed trust would be to say, keep them well away from the finances of the organisation for a little while. And trust helps to build communities. And that kind of trust will do good things and continues to do good things. And this isn't just me speaking as someone who's been involved in prison chaplaincy. I've been involved as a church pastor, as a minister. I'm a Baptist minister, I'm afraid, rather than a Methodist minister. But I've been involved in working in churches that have helped people coming out of prison to settle well into our churches. Misplaced trust can be damaging. I was involved in a charity that when someone came out of prison, instantly put someone who'd come out of prison and had been in prison for charity fraud, they put them in charge of the finances, and the charity was very nearly sunk. Misplaced trust can be really unhelpful, but misplaced mistrust can be equally damaging. The reality is that trusting relationships take time to develop, and knowing what is genuine trust and what is misplaced trust takes time, as with all relationships. Let's talk about safeguarding of different types of prison leavers. And I'm not going to say that some are worse and some are better, but there are certain levels of risk. Now, working with all prison leavers, first thing that I want to say and underline this is that Welcome Directory does not make referrals. All we are is a directory of churches and other faith communities that say people leaving prison are welcome here. So the chaplain won't say, go along to ... Methodist Church. The chaplain will say, in Rotherham, there are these Methodist churches or these Baptist churches or these Christian churches. You might want to try these out for yourself. They've said that they're welcoming to people coming out of prison. What the Welcome Directory does do is it does give you an opportunity to review your existing safeguarding procedures and to liaise with your safeguarding advisors to see, actually, are our safeguarding policies in this church appropriate and suitable for helping people that have got complex needs that might be coming out of prison. The Welcome Directory has got some resources. So we've got a little booklet that James wrote recently that says, you know, what do I do if someone comes out of prison and comes along to my church? And we've also got a kind of bolt-on that we wrote together with the probation service that says, what would an extra bolt-on to a standard church's safeguarding policy look like to help it to be better equipped in helping people coming out of prison? It's really important that we welcome people, all prison leavers, as someone new visiting in line with your safeguarding policy. For many faith communities, registering with the Welcome Directorate often provides a good opportunity to do that. As a part of registration as well, we also ask you about your prior experience of working with prison leavers or working in prison itself. And if you haven't worked previously, if your church hasn't worked previously with people coming out of prison, then we've got a prisons awareness course, which takes some of the materials from this session and an awful lot more and helps to develop that over 3 sessions. And as part of the approval process for your church, we'll look at your experience and talk to various people that you'll identify about some of the concerns that you may have. What we've described so far is relevant for all prison leavers, but especially for low and medium risk prison leavers. So people who are relatively low, or what the probation service would call medium risk offenders. However, there are some situations which are dealt with slightly differently because of requirements for safety for all. Just like I explained earlier, we all need to be safe. And at this point, we're talking about high risk offences. Now, in high risk offences, in some ways, it's easier to deal with people with high risk offences. Catherine, if you want to go on to the next slide, because these things are dictated to a certain extent by statute. When someone leaves prison and they've committed a high-risk offence, they will be under what are called multi-agency public protection arrangements, MAPA arrangements, and there will be responsibilities for them to engage with appropriate statutory authorities. And if they were going to come to church and that was deemed to be a risk, then you would know about that. So you would be informed by the probation service, you would be informed by their MAPA officer. They may have license conditions that says that if they're going to go to church, they will have to have a safeguarding contract of some sort or safeguarding arrangements of some sort. People who have committed high-risk offences are on what's called the VISOR database, and that's a database that agencies who are working with these people is able to access to see what the risks are and to see how those risks can best be mitigated. The denominations and churches have their own processes, their own templates, their own contracts, and I know that Katie is going to talk a little bit more specifically about what the Methodist Church have for that. If you have any safeguarding concerns at all about someone who's come out of prison and is starting to come along to your church, then once they really simply and easily, then do report that to the appropriate statutory authority. You know, we often get worried about getting in touch with probation or the police or whatever just to ask for advice. I've been a pastor. I've had people come into my church who I was concerned about, had spoken to them, got to know them, and have spoken to the probation services to how best to deal with them. And that worked very well, helped us to integrate and to support somebody who had committed quite serious sexual offences in our church. It is work, it does take work, but if we are to see the kingdom and to see the light of God continue to work through people's lives, I think that it's completely worth that work. I would say, you know, work with probation where at all possible. It is important, I think, for us to be able to do that and not to be concerned about asking for advice or talking to people who are experts in these areas. So just to emphasize then, really, 2 levels of offence, low and medium risk, and with low and medium risk people, you know, we have a responsibility to our churches to look after them, but we also have a responsibility to welcome people appropriately. With high risk offences, there will be statutory responsibilities that you will have as a church, and you will know about these people if they're going to come into your church. Katie, I'll hand over to you now to talk about how the Methodist Church deals with some of these things specifically.
Thanks, Bob. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Katie Spencer-Mellon. I'm the District Safeguarding Officer for the Yorkshire North and East Methodist District. And I want to just take what Bob has just talked about and just explain how we manage potential risk within the Methodist Church by explaining our procedures, our safeguarding procedures, and how that all works. I recognise that not everybody here will be from the Methodist Church, but I can say, because we do work ecumenically, most major denominations work in a very similar way to how the Methodist Church works. So it may be that actually what I'm about to say is very similar for your context as well. For free churches or churches that aren't affiliated with a denomination, then what you'll find is that you will have somebody locally who will be putting these things that I'm talking about in place. You'll have a safeguarding officer or lead who will do that locally. But generally, each Methodist district has a district safeguarding officer, or we call them a DSO for short. And if signing up to the Welcome Directory, I would encourage you to become familiar with your district safeguarding officer or your safeguarding lead for your denomination, and make it known to them that it's your intention to sign up and your intention to want to welcome prison leavers into the church community, because your safeguarding lead will be able to offer some support and advice and will be able to walk with you along the way. But in the Methodist Church, if a prison leaver or someone who's committed offences is wishing to attend and be part of the church, this is often reported firstly to the district safeguarding officer. And what the district safeguarding officer would often do is organise finding out further details relating to any offences. And we very often do this by communicating directly with the individual. And me personally, I generally I do this by asking them to tell me their story. So not just focusing on the offences itself, but tell me about you, tell me about your life, tell me about your experiences that has led to this offending behaviour. And it's really a privilege to hear somebody's story, but also you can get a picture of actually what it is they have been through and what they've experienced within their life, and the struggles that they may have had. And that's really important, I think, when you're welcoming a prison leaver into church, because you need to know how you can support them and welcome them safely. We also do talk to any statutory authority involvement. So some people do have probation officers or risk management officers when they do leave prison. And where it's appropriate, we will communicate with them. We always make sure that an individual has pastoral care and support, and this can often be given by the minister or somebody else within the church, just that gentle support, somebody there to talk to, particularly if they're having to relive painful memories and experiences and things like that. It's really important to have that pastoral care for them. But once we know more, we can then make decisions as to see what safeguarding measures are necessary. And as Bob has mentioned, in situations where there is low risk, there may be no safeguarding measures necessary, or there may be very few safeguarding measures that are necessary, other than to make sure that the person is well cared for and supported within the church community that they're seeking to be part of. Because again, we remember that they are vulnerable and they need support and they need protection. And district safeguarding officers can help churches determine how they can support an individual. And we can also signpost to other people that may be able to help as well. But for people who what we call higher risk offenders, or those who it isn't quite clear the level of risk that they may pose to other people, the district safeguarding officer would arrange for a risk assessment to be carried out. And there may need to be more formal safeguarding measures in place, and this would normally be in the form of a safeguarding contract. That's the terminology and the language that the Methodist Church uses, but I know the denominations use that as well. A safeguarding contract is simply an agreement between the individual who may pose a risk and the church they attend. And this safeguarding contract would outline the ways in which they can engage in the life of the church and ways that they would be asked not to become engaged or involved. For example, someone who had committed offences towards children would potentially be asked things such as make sure that you're not on the premises when children's work and activities are being carried out, such as Messy Church, etc., youth groups, etc. The safeguarding contract also takes into consideration any licence conditions or statutory authority agreements or arrangements, because we have to work in harmony with those things and take those things seriously, because if somebody breaches those conditions, they are potentially facing a return to prison. So we really need to work with the arrangements that are already in place, as Bob has mentioned. And I do have an example of a situation that I've had where a church didn't take an individual's licence conditions seriously and kept inviting that individual to take part in things that they just couldn't do. And that person did actually end up breaching their conditions and return to prison. And that's not right for them. That's not safe. So as part of keeping them safe, we work with what's already in place and make sure that we are encouraging them as much as we can possibly do to follow what arrangements are already there. The safeguarding contract that will be put in place would be overseen by a small group of people. We call these people monitoring and support group, and they are there to oversee things, to monitor things, but also meet with that individual and to offer some support and assess how things are going. A safeguarding contract and a monitoring and support group would all be put in place by a district safeguarding officer who would help provide advice and guidance along the way. And they also receive training too as well, which is really important in order to help them fulfill their role properly. I think some people, and speaking from experience, some people can find that the safeguarding procedures that we have don't necessarily give a welcoming atmosphere that we want to present to someone leaving prison. And some people can find it off-putting and don't want to engage with these procedures that we have. But we really try to do our utmost to be gentle, and we ensure that pastoral support is always offered throughout any conversations that we do have. I think particularly with high-risk offenders, there are practical safeguarding measures needed, and it can seem a really daunting thing. It can seem like a huge commitment, but I wouldn't want safeguarding ever to be a barrier to welcoming a prison leaver into a church community. I think faith communities should be places of welcome and refuge for prison leavers. And I hope that through the work that the Welcome Directory is doing, that more people leaving prison are able to find safe spaces to worship when they are released back into the community. Safeguarding is ultimately there for the care and protection of all people, including the prison leaver. Safeguarding, it might seem overwhelming, but it really genuinely doesn't need to be. If you contact your district safeguarding officer right at the beginning, or your safeguarding lead, whoever that might be, we work really carefully with our local churches to make sure that everything is put in place, everything that needs to be put in place is, and that there's ongoing support and guidance for everybody involved. We are there to walk with you and journey with you, however difficult and however rocky that journey might be. That's what we are there for. So I would encourage you to speak to your safeguarding lead, speak to your district safeguarding officer, and have those conversations and see whether this might be something for you. I'm going to pass back. I'm not sure who I'm passing back to, but I'm sure someone will take over.
I think that's me. So thank you, Katie. There'll be an opportunity for questions in just a moment. I've just been given like 2 minutes to, the title is How to be Part of the Solution. How to be part of the solution. I want to echo what Katie said there. Have conversations in your faith community, speak with your safeguarding lead, speak with your circuit superintendent, your circuit stewards, whoever you need to. Get the conversations going. A Welcome Directory, we want to support you in those conversations, big part of what we do. And to help facilitate that, there's a number of things. You can find details for all this on our website, but Bob's already mentioned the prison awareness course. It's 3 sessions. We've got one coming up in June. There are still spaces, and I think we could make space for you if you wanted to join that. It's free if you're interested in registering. We have quarterly, I'm going to call them online Zoom forums, where we have people from various faith communities. It's open to the public, can come share some of the stories, share some of the challenges, and we invite external organisations to come and share how they can support you. So, for example, we had a debt advice organisation a little bit ago come and talk about how they can support faith communities in supporting people who struggle with finance, which is a big issue for people who've been in prison. So those quarterly Zoom forums are really helpful. I think Bob mentioned we have a guide that's the Welcome Directory Guide to Welcoming Prison Leavers into Your Faith Community. If you want help with thinking things through, I'd suggest you download that from our websites in PDF form. Have a look through it, again, have conversations. All this is available on the resource page of our website. Go to welcomedirectory.org.uk, click on the resource page link, and you'll find lots of stuff like this. The only other thing I would say, how to be part of the solution, if you want something practical to start doing straight away, is go away and start to look for organisations locally that can support you. So who's the contact at the council housing department that you may need to get in contact with? Who are your local debt advice people? Who are the drug and alcohol support people? Who are the mental health? Where's the mental health support line locally? All avenues that you can point people who've been in prison to for that extra support that they might need. I'm going to be quiet there. Check out the website. Oh, and don't forget as well, if you want to talk more or find out more information, do email us. Again, you can find email addresses on the website. We'd love to have more one-to-one conversations about any questions, comments, ideas you might have. So we do want to allow a time for question and answer, so I'm going to be quiet there. If we could have the whole meeting back on, that would be really helpful. And then you've got Emily, Bob, James, Siggy, Katie, a few others. We're happy to have questions. Who wants to be first?
Okay, does anybody have any burning questions for our beautiful panel today? Well, I have a question. I was just thinking about the training that you were talking about. And am I right in thinking that if a church is interested in supporting people leaving prison, that the training is a prerequisite? Am I right in thinking that or not?
That's a great question. So coming back to the point that I think Bob made earlier about making sure that faith communities have prior experience. So for churches who've never engaged in this work, that is a prerequisite for engagement. It's one of our 4 registration requirements. So just for background info, our 4 registration requirements are permission from your church leader. The second one is a policy, having a safeguarding policy, active culture in place. The third is a point of contact, someone in your faith community who will be that go-between. And then the fourth and final point is, coming back to what you've mentioned, Siggy, is prior experience. So if a faith community, if a church is already doing this kind of work, that's fantastic, and you would then be eligible to register anyway. The Prisons Awareness course is designed for those who had no exposure, who don't have any experience. That said, the course is available to all. So if you've got years and years experience and you'd still like to attend, would love to have you there. So they would also be very welcome. So yeah, as James mentioned, do drop us an email. We'd love to have you on that course to welcome you to that.
Great stuff. Thank you, Emily. Does anybody else have any questions? And if you can't think of any now, you can come back to us. And as James has said, you can contact all the Welcome team through the website if you have questions going forward. So anyone else got any questions? Katie Spencer-Madden. Yeah.
Hi. I was just wondering, have you any stories or sort of good news examples from churches that have signed up to the Welcome Directory and have welcome prison leaders within their congregation? Have you got any examples or stories that you've come across during your experience?
I mean, I can comment briefly from the start, but then I might actually lean towards Bob, because I know Bob's got a great story about how the organisation was birthed, essentially. But we have done we did do a survey at the start of the year, reaching out to faith communities, asking about how they've engaged. We're recognising that COVID actually has really been quite a barrier. But we have had some long registered churches prior to the Welcome Directory who have been liaising and engaging with other churches equally interested in engaging. But it is quite challenging sometimes to know exactly who is a prison leaver if it's not been an offence that they've in a church setting that doesn't require them to disclose it. So in that circumstance, people might not think they have a prison leaver amongst them, but actually they do. And I think that is one of the challenges that we face in our work, which I realise doesn't necessarily answer your question directly, Katie. But Bob, I don't know if you're able to share the story about Do you know the one I'm referring to?
I think so, yes. Yeah.
Thanks. Bit cryptic.
I mean, there's a couple of things of because we don't refer anybody, we don't refer, and so we don't get feedback from those that we've referred. And that's quite an important part of our ethos. So that continues. But actually, we do have quite a wide range of narrative that's developing, partly through people like Trishan, who are prison leavers that are willing to engage with us and help us really to tell the story of people that are coming out of prison and settling in faith communities. Or actually, some of the prison leavers that we're working with are people who have come out of prison and haven't resettled, and they help to tell the story as well. But I think the story that Emily's referring to is a chap called, I'll call him Gary because that's his name, and he's given me permission to tell this story. He became a Christian in prison. He'd been a builder previously, never really had any contact with church. He found himself in prison, and he went along to church on a Sunday morning because he'd heard that was a thing that you could do, and he was fed up of being in his cell, and he heard them praying the Lord's Prayer. Now, this is not a great evangelistic technique, but Billy Graham didn't invent this one. He heard him praying the Lord's Prayer, and during praying the Lord's Prayer, he gave his life to the Lord. He made a Christian commitment at that point, because he'd never really kind of listened to the Lord's Prayer before. And when he listened to it, he thought, yeah, that means something. He engaged all the way through his sentence with chaplaincy, came along to all the groups that we did. As it got towards the end of his sentence, he came to us and he says, do you know of any churches in ... area? We'll keep some of his anonymity for him. Do you know of any churches in this area? And we said, yeah, we know of a good church in that area who are a Welcome Directory registered church. In fact, I think they were something like the third community to register on the Welcome Directory. They said, yes, we know of this church. Would you like us to make contact? So we contacted them. A couple of people from the church came in and met him, had a chat with him. On the first Sunday after he was released, they went along to pick him up from his house, actually. He'd arranged that, he'd agreed with that, took him to the church. He settled into the church fairly quickly. They built up a relationship of trust and of oversight with him. He would have been in the low to medium risk category of offender rather than a high risk offender. He got well and truly settled into the life of the church, has since been married, is still now 12 years down the line, still engaged with the church, still growing in his Christian faith. There are other stories that I could tell that don't end so well, but Gary's story was an incredible positive experience. And if you read some of particularly Ruth Armstrong from the Institute of Criminology's research, she talks a lot about the impact that positive engagement with faith communities can have for people who have expressed their faith during their prison sentence. And then that positive experience helps them to have pro-social models, to have communities of support, to have people that they can look up to know how to live different lives, the sorts of lives that they really want to live. And I would say the sorts of lives that God always wanted them to live. I hope that helps a little bit, Katie. Ask a Baptist minister to answer any question. There will always be at least 3 points.
That's a
Bob,
great.
thank you so much. Thank you. I mean, and that's a really lovely story. And it's the good stories that we need to hang on to. Thank you, Bob, and I hope that answers your question, Katie. I'm very aware of the time. We need to stop, but please, if there are further questions that occur to you, please do get in touch. And I'd like to say thank you to all our presenters today, and especially to Trishan, who was willing to share his story. It was just great to hear from him too. James, I will hand over to you, and if you would please close our meeting with a prayer.
Yeah, thank you, Siggy. Now, I'm really aware we talked a lot about information and ideas, but ultimately whatever happens in church is a work of God through the Holy Spirit. And so I want to commit everything we've said, just to God to help whatever the next journey is for us. Let's just close our eyes. I know we're on Zoom, and just yeah. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you that you have a heart for every man, every woman and child. Thank you that you so loved the world that you gave your Son for everyone. Yeah, and God, our heart this afternoon is for people who have been in prison, and struggling to find a way of progressing their faith when they leave. Father, we pray for each one of them, even those that are being released today, who now find themselves outside the prison gate for the first time in a long time. God, we pray that you would help them in their journey. And for us as faith communities and in our own work and roles, God, I pray that you'd help us to understand the next step that you are calling us to take as individuals and as churches. So in this moment of prayer, Father, we would say, here I am, send me. Thank you for this time together. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone. And God be with you throughout your day today.
Thank you.